When the Russian army captured the Chernobyl plant, that familiar fear returned. The fear of a nuclear disaster.
This is the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. It's a household name.
The world still remembers the Chernobyl disaster of 1986.
The Chernobyl explosion became the largest nuclear disaster in the world history.
But Russia's capture of Chernobyl in early 2022 was just the overture. A short while later, Vladimir Putin's soldiers marched on Europe's largest nuclear power plant, Zaporizhzhia. How secure are nuclear power plants in wartime?
What's at stake is the nuclear safety and security of the biggest nuclear power plant in the European continent.
And Russia has also threatened to use nuclear weapons.
Why do we need a world if there's no Russia?
I'm not bluffing.
This is the story of how the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant and its workers became hostages.
When they failed to find weapons quickly, they began to torture me.
Events in Ukraine that would change Europe. My name is Pavlo. I'm a Ukrainian filmmaker. I was born in 1981 in Kyiv. My parents and grandparents were Soviet scientists. I was 4 years old on the day of the Chernobyl disaster. And this is my home city, Kyiv, on February 24th, 2022.
In the early hours of this morning, the Russian President Vladimir Putin launched an all-out assault on Ukraine.
Attacks were reported in Mariupol, the eastern border region, Kharkiv, and the capital Kyiv.
Russian tanks are moving into Ukraine from all directions. Fighting has erupted.
Whoever tries to stand in our way should know that Russia's response will be immediate and involve consequences that you have never experienced in your history.
Seemingly overnight, a large and free European country was facing a war of aggression from its neighbor. And we Ukrainians suddenly found ourselves stuck in traffic, together with our kids, our families, and our dreams. But also with our fears for the biggest nuclear power plant in Europe. That's when the world learned how to pronounce the long name Zaporizhzhia. The Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant lies in the Zaporizhzhia Oblast in the south of the country, near the city of Enerhodar and the Dnipro River. The huge Kakhovka Dam is just 130 kilometers away. Before the invasion, the plant produced 20% of Ukraine's electricity. These days, Zaporizhzhia is often in the headlines, but the people who work there are rarely heard. Serhiy Romaniuk used to be responsible for the spent fuel storage facility at Zaporizhzhia. He now lives in Kyiv.
I woke up as usual to start work. I had breakfast, drank coffee, and got ready. That's when I realized a full-scale invasion of Ukraine was underway.
This is another witness who was at the plant when the Russian invasion began. He wishes to remain anonymous for safety reasons.
My friend from Kharkiv called me and said, "We're under attack. A military base right near me has been bombed." I said, "That can't be true. What are you talking about?" And he said, "Believe me, you'd better get out of here. It's war."
Russian military vehicles have invaded the Kiev region. The enemy has advanced through the Vilcha border crossing. The troops of the occupying forces entered the Chernobyl exclusion zone from the territory of Belarus.
We were so shocked. We knew that we could face the same situation.
Lyudmila Kozak works at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. That day, she had gotten ready for what she thought would be a routine shift.
On February 23rd, I began my shift. I work in security, so it's my job to keep an eye on the plant and the equipment. At 8 a.m., the morning crew did not arrive to take over from us. There were lots of planes and helicopters flying over from the direction of Belarus. And then at 3:45 p.m., we saw on our monitors how men dressed in black were entering the site.
The Presidential Office of Ukraine has confirmed that Russian troops have seized the Chernobyl nuclear power plant.
They started destroying our equipment. They broke down the fences and just climbed over them. Suddenly, there were lots of vehicles and strangers around. This is the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. It's a household name. It was the first one. They came in and said, "Now everyone will pay attention to us." That's how we became hostages. They started looting everything. They kicked down doors, threw tables, cabinets, equipment, everything out of the windows. It was like, if I can't have it, neither can anyone else. The soldiers wanted to touch the isotopes. They'd say, "Let me touch the radiation." What do you say to that?
For the Russian troops to start essentially going through that area, and at least from what I had read, actually stealing equipment and things out of there, my reaction was, this is pure stupidity.
The Chernobyl disaster on April 26, 1986. I remember that soon afterwards I was told to pack my things, not just fast, but immediately. And that I wasn't allowed to take any of my favorite toy cars.
The Chernobyl explosion became the largest nuclear disaster in the world history, which contaminated a good part of Ukrainian territory, Belarusian, some parts of Western Russia, and certainly affected big parts of Europe as well.
With no official information, rumors soon spread that it wasn't safe to stay in Kyiv. Railway tickets sold out immediately. We bought the last airplane tickets available.
There were a number of key reasons for that accident. One of them, and probably the key one, were the major issues with the reactor, the so-called RBMK reactor. The basic design of the reactor was taken from the military-industrial complex. It was designed to produce plutonium, enrich uranium for the nuclear bombs, and for that reason the design of the reactor was top secret.
That was when I learned the word evakuacja. My grandfather couldn't come with us. As a physicist, he was not given authorization by the KGB to leave the Kyiv region. That nuclear energy accident ruined the health and lives of countless people. Its widespread effects soon became apparent across Europe.
There were suddenly strange reports from Scandinavia, I think it was on April the 27th or 28th, of increased radiation levels that no one could explain.
For days, the government in Moscow imposed an information blackout. It wasn't until mid-May that the public was informed of the actual extent of the accident.
On day 2 of the Russian invasion, the Kharkiv region was perhaps the hardest hit. There's fighting in the Sumy region. Okhterka has suffered massive Russian shelling all day, and the fighting is ongoing.
The UN estimate of 100,000 internally displaced people may well be too low.
After the Russian invasion, Ukraine was the global news story. A war of aggression, in violation of international law, was taking place in Europe. For the first time since the end of the Cold War, there was the threat of a nuclear attack. And a civilian nuclear power plant was about to be caught up in the fighting.
On the second day of the invasion, February 25th, we realized that the chances of the Zaporizhzhia power plant being captured were very high. We understood that we were already pretty much surrounded.
The management of the Zaporizhzhia plant started constantly calling meetings. My supervisor took part in these. They discussed what to do if there was damage to the infrastructure and how to respond in the case of shelling. In these anti-crisis centers, units were tasked with getting ready, with reviewing documents and developing new measures. This work was going on all the time. The residents of Enerhodar were getting ready for the occupiers to arrive. And the mayor of Enerhodar, Dmitry Orlov, played a key role.
The situation in the city is stable, but unfortunately remains tense. All businesses are operating normally. The military and law enforcement officers are all in position and ready to defend our city. That week, we managed to set up several improvised fortifications. Local residents organized it themselves. They're against this large-scale aggression and believe that Enerhodar belongs to Ukraine. More than 10,000 citizens gathered.
If NATO countries send their troops to Ukraine, the moment of which Putin once said, "Why do we need a world in which there's no Russia?" will come. Then we'll let everything fly in all directions.
Between February 24th and 28th, people were constantly gathering at the entrance to the city of Enerhodar. They brought several trucks and set up concrete blocks to seal off the road. As far as I recall, some of the residents even welded together tank barriers. Those were then transported to the checkpoint at the entrance to Enerhodar.
The people came without weapons, they just had flags. This happened 3 times, and 3 times we managed to force the column of tanks and armored vehicles to turn back. Then, at around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, they came in a large convoy of around 100 vehicles. They opened fire onto the checkpoint from a tank a few kilometers away. This battle at the city entrance, if you can call it a battle, lasted several hours. Then they drove through to the power plant.
The invaders had to drive through the city in order to access the only road leading to the plant.
On March 3rd, around 2,200 people came to work at the Zaporizhzhia power plant. That was a reduced workforce. Normally, there would have been 11,000 employees. This was one of the management's anti-crisis measures. We were doing our work when at some point in the afternoon, it became clear that we might not be able to go home that day. It was decided that all the staff who were at the Zaporizhzhia plant would stay at work until the situation became safer. We were constantly messaging and calling our families in the city. A column of enemy vehicles was driving in the direction of the first control point of the Zaporizhzhia plant. The actual attack began around 10 p.m. We were inside the plant the whole time. Management told us to stay in the shelters. Later, the occupiers retreated. And I don't know, we had this small moment of joy where we thought, maybe this is it. Maybe they'll stop now. But they were just regrouping. During the next wave of attacks, a shot from a tank practically destroyed the third floor of the training center, where 20 Special Forces soldiers were deployed.
A direct attack on a nuclear facility had seemed unthinkable. So only a small number of elite soldiers remained at the power plant and in the city of Enerhodar. All regular troops were needed to defend the strategically important cities of Kherson and Zaporizhzhia.
We had the radio on. The shift supervisor at the power plant kept saying, "Stop firing. You're shooting at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. You're risking a nuclear disaster." If I remember correctly, the loudspeakers fell silent at around 3 o'clock in the morning. The shelling stopped. And we sat holding our breath, listening. We didn't know what was happening.
By 5 a.m. on March 4th, the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant was under Russian control. Eyewitnesses reported that 3 people were killed, 2 wounded, and between 30 and 40 taken prisoner while trying to hold off the attack. According to Ukraine's state nuclear power plant operator Enerhoatom, most of them are still in captivity.
Russian troops have attacked Zaporizhzhia, Europe's largest nuclear power plant. An incident here could be 6 times worse than Chernobyl.
Your power plant is on the front line of the continent's bloodiest war in decades after.
Russian forces attacked the Zaporizhzhia plant in the middle of the night, setting a nearby training facility on fire.
I was woken up in the night, and I immediately received the videos where you could see the fighting around the plant. We were able to give the all clear for the experts relatively quickly because the safety of the plant had not been affected. But the fact that there was fighting and shooting at a nuclear power plant, that was a real shock.
To understand what's at stake today, it's important to understand the role that nuclear power has played in my country's history.
By the 1960s, Ukrainian economy was developing quite rapidly, but there was lack of energy sources, and nuclear power became a solution. So it is about the population, it is about the development of economy and need for sources of energy, which at that time, 60s, 70s, nuclear seemed like the right way to go.
Nuclear power plants like Zaporizhzhia and Chernobyl were a source of great pride for the Soviet leadership. And while they couldn't be showcased during the annual May Day parades, other nuclear achievements could be. When the Soviet Union collapsed, Ukraine inherited the nuclear power plants and the nuclear weapons on its territory, along with all the associated risks.
You still have, like during the Cold War, two nuclear superpowers, the United States and Russia. For a short period of time, there was a third one. The name of that country was Ukraine.
Those nuclear weapons weren't just there like a gun that you could go ahead and use. They didn't have the launch approvals for those nuclear weapons. And for the most part, what I believe is those nuclear weapons were nothing but an enormous burden to Ukraine. Because the most dangerous part of nuclear weapons is when you take them apart. And to take apart 1,000+ nuclear weapons in a country that doesn't have all the capabilities and facilities for that is dangerous. Ukraine in general wanted to play the role that it's going to be a responsible country.
Which is why on December 5th, 1994, Ukraine signed what went down in history as the Budapest Memorandum.
The United States, Russia, and the United Kingdom signed an agreement with the government in Ukraine that the Ukrainians would give up the nuclear weapons they had inherited from the Soviet Union in return for a number of things. And the most important parts of the in return for that would be to be guaranteed the sovereignty of Ukraine, not to use nuclear weapons against Ukraine, not to be threatened with nuclear weapons. And that's what Putin and Russia violated.
Russia became the main perpetrator and the violator of the Budapest Memorandum, attacking Ukraine, first in 2014, then in 2022.
It's not only that it violated that memorandum, it essentially puts into question anything that any country would ever sign to have another country not develop nuclear weapons or to give up nuclear weapons. If you give them that sort of a guarantee, and Russia broke that guarantee, totally irresponsible, and it has reverberations much beyond Ukraine.
That first morning after the occupation of Europe's largest nuclear power plant was full of uncertainty for the employees.
I remember that at 8 a.m., we were told to leave the shelter and head to the first checkpoint. I think there were between 15 and 18 of us, so we set off. I remember how quiet it was as we walked. Your blood runs cold. You're walking and thinking, what will I do when I meet the Russian soldiers? How will they behave? Will they shoot me dead or not? The new shift came to relieve us. At around 10 a.m., we made our way to the second checkpoint.
I came to the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant to relieve the colleagues who were there from the morning of March 3rd to noon on March 4th. My job was, shall we say, to assess the damage to the buildings and facilities that fall under the jurisdiction of the Nuclear Safety Department.
The entrance gate and the training center had been destroyed. The administrative offices were damaged. The Russian army was setting up a military base on the grounds of the nuclear plant.
We immediately understood the enormous risks that could be derived from the fact that the plant had been occupied by the Russian forces, which could make this a target in a military conflict.
Vladimir Putin, meanwhile, issued another threat, this time directed at NATO.
All of this could really lead to a conflict where nuclear weapons are used. That would mean the destruction of civilization. Don't they understand that?
We met more and more Russian military personnel at the power plant. I even had a brief conversation with soldiers from a special unit from Ossetia. They called everyone brother. They'd say, "Brother, where's the canteen?" and so on.
The occupation also really changed life in the city of Enerhodar. For example, my wife and I had to stand in line for 6 hours just to buy bread.
But there was also a ray of hope at that time.
The Russian military has left the Chernobyl nuclear power plant.
Reports say Russian soldiers are now marching in 2 columns towards the Ukrainian-Belarusian border.
We had waited a long time for that moment. 600 hours. A long, long time. It felt like an eternity. Every day was the same, over and over. And then one day later, our intercom rang and we heard a voice say, "Open the door. We're the Ukrainian Armed Forces." When I got to my apartment that day, I just lay down on my bed and told myself, I'm home.
The main reason of taking over the Chernobyl nuclear power plant was just secure the advance of the Russian troops toward Kyiv. And eventually, once they realized what they're in possession of, they were using the Chernobyl nuclear power plant as a shelter. They assumed correctly that Ukrainians would not attack the nuclear power plant, and really turned it into their logistical base and one of the centers of their offensive against Kyiv.
Once Chernobyl was free, the head of the International Atomic Energy Agency came to meet the workers.
How are you? Very good. Congratulations. Fantastic. Great job. Great job.
I want to ask you from all the personnel of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, please send the message to the world. We have respect to everybody in this world. And please, have respect to us.
Absolutely. We do not only have respect for you, we have admiration for you. Because you did exactly what you were expected to do. You showed professionalism,
courage, of course, patriotism, but you did the right thing.
Meanwhile, the staff of Zaporizhzhia were still working under coercion. Any hope that they would be liberated quickly had faded.
The way you run a nuclear facility is inherently dangerous, so you have to run it right. And now to go in and to have the reactor operators have to work at gunpoint. I mean, this is totally against everything we've learned about nuclear safety. It's totally against everything the Russians have taught about nuclear safety.
Later, somewhere around the middle of 2022, Rinat Ivanovich Karcha appeared at the plant.
Rinat Karcha is thought to have close links to the Kremlin. He currently works for Russia's state-owned nuclear entity Rosatom, which has been operating the Zaporizhzhia plant since its occupation.
His main goal was to persuade the Ukrainian personnel to sign a contract with Rosatom. He would say, you see, there is a Ukrainian chair and a Russian chair, but we, my colleagues, are sitting on the nuclear chair. We are committed to safety. We are neither part of the Russian aggression, nor are we defending the Ukrainians. We're committed to safety. We have to think about nuclear safety first and foremost. I am here with you at the power plant. He's a convincing speaker and speaks very calmly without emotion. During the conversation, he gradually wraps himself around you like a snake. And then suddenly, he has you in his grip.
The workers responded in different ways to the rhetoric, which was basically a thinly concealed threat. The International Atomic Energy Agency was still trying to gain access to the power plant occupied by Russian forces.
The situation of the staff at the plant has, from the very beginning, been one of the most pressing points. Obviously, being at a territory which is occupied by another country, beyond the situation of the nuclear power plant, is extremely traumatic. Zaporizhzhia is completely out of control. Physical integrity of the place has not been respected. There was shelling at the beginning of the war. What's at stake is the nuclear safety and security of the biggest nuclear power plant in the European continent.
Special operations forces linked to Ukraine's intelligence service tried to liberate the area around the nuclear power plant 3 times. The first attempt was in August 2022. Ukrainian forces crossed the Kakhovka reservoir, but they were forced to retreat. 2 more unsuccessful landing attempts followed. At the end of August, a team from the IAEA set off for the Zaporizhzhia power plant.
It took us a long time to be able to go.
Speed up. In the middle, stay in the middle, landmine. Stay in the middle. All Victor, stay in the middle.
Copy it. All Victor, stay in the middle.
When we went, I led that mission on September 1st, 2022, so it took me like 6 months to be able to go.
No.
All Victors, report your status.
Victor 3, all good.
This is a war, and the plant is at the front line. There is security presence. The armed forces are in the vicinity. This is a combat zone, all of that area of the Zaporizhzhia province. You may have situations where The security people will say, well, you cannot do this, or you can't do this, or this is dangerous, or we don't want you to go to a certain part of the plant. I was shown the roof of a very big hall where fresh fuel is stored. And this place, it was quite amazing, had very big holes on the rooftop of this building, which hosts a lot of nuclear material.
During his visit, Rafael Grossi was shown a missile. An IAEA employee said that the angle of impact indicated it had been fired from Russian positions. But the man Russia had appointed to manage the occupied plant, Renat Karcha, claimed that these were Ukrainian missiles that changed direction just before landing.
But the moment we set foot, we never left. I left a first deployment mission of experts, and then these have been rotating. They stay there, they sleep there, they eat there, they work there for a month, more or less, and then they are changed.
Well, what you can see right behind me is the special delegation of the International Atomic Energy Agency.
We all had high hopes and high expectations for this mission. When Rafael Grossi visited the power plant, we thought things would change, that we would finally be able to breathe a sigh of relief. But the Ukrainian staff had practically no opportunity to talk to Rafael Grossi or the other members of the IAEA mission. I was among those who became increasingly disappointed with each visit by the IAEA. They would come, record facts, draw up reports, but it wouldn't lead anywhere. The pressure on the staff remained.
Ukraine's Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant was knocked offline on Thursday due to shelling.
The attacks are said to have hit nearby high-voltage power lines.
The plant was shut down yesterday after a power failure.
Thousands upon thousands of residents in the region lost power.
After nearby power lines were destroyed, Unit 6, the last reactor still in operation at Zaporizhzhia, was disconnected from the grid. Unit 6 had previously supplied the other 5 units with electricity so that they could remain in a safe, cold state.
What they wanted is they wanted to control the electricity. They wanted to make sure the Ukrainians didn't have access to that electricity. So what I have called it is, I'd mentioned before that that nuclear terrorism is really important and worrisome.
Despite the ongoing presence of the IAEA inspectors, it's clear the supposedly stable situation could deteriorate at any time.
There are two major spokespersons for Russia and Russian blackmail tactics. One is President Putin himself, who alludes to the use of nuclear weapons in different ways, but doesn't talk about that directly. And then the former president of Russia, Dmitry Medvedev, who actually talks about that openly.
Russia has repeatedly sought to spread fear in this area.
This is not a bluff. And those who are trying to blackmail us with nuclear weapons should know that the wind can turn in their direction as well.
It happened on September 12, 2022. That's when I was arrested at work. They drove me to my home first.
Повезли з роботи спочатку на квартиру. Дякувати Богові.
Thank God my wife and children had already left for Ukrainian-controlled territory. As far as I understood, their main purpose of that search was to look for weapons, which they hoped to find in my apartment. When they failed to find weapons quickly, they began to torture me. They put a bag over my head and pressed a hot iron on my chest. After that, they took me to a cell. There were, say, 10 to 20 prisoners in that room. Instead of the iron, they began using electricity. They used electricity as a method of torture and would pour water over my body to increase the effect. You have no idea how long you're going to be in a situation like that. Now I know that I was there from September 12th to October 27th. They put me in a car and started driving. They read me an order that I was to be deported from the occupied territory. Then they gave me my passport and told me to walk towards the territory held by Ukraine.
For months now, Russia has been deliberately bombing power plants and electricity facilities. According to official figures, around half of Ukraine's energy infrastructure has been destroyed.
Russian strikes on our energy sector and power plants have not stopped for a single day. Right now, just like in recent days, the overall situation means it's necessary to severely restrict the use of electricity-intensive devices at peak times. Please use the points of invincibility shelters while the repairs continue. You can warm up there.
It was a normal working day. I was working from home, doing something or other for Energoatom, when there was a knock at the door. For a long time, I didn't want to open it. The moment I did, I realized that was it. There were 3 men armed with assault rifles and wearing balaclavas. They said my name. Is that you? Yes, we're coming in. They began searching the house. Their most pressing question was, why haven't you signed the contract? You're a qualified professional. Why are you sitting around at home? The power plant is in danger. I started crying and promised, guys, I understand. I'll sign the contract. At that moment, I only had one goal: to pull the wool over their eyes so that I wouldn't end up in a torture cell. I sang like a bird, made up stories, said I was neutral. Eventually, they let me go, but said, don't kid yourself, my friend. You're being watched. We know everything about you. Even when you go home, you are being followed.
Six months after his first visit, Rafael Grossi traveled to Zaporizhzhia for a second time. The road which the delegation took from Ukrainian to Russian-occupied territory looked very different to when they first came. The trip prompted the IAEA to issue another appeal.
I went to the United Nations Security Council and I presented 5 basic principles that should be observed to avoid a major accident. I would reduce it to 2 things. Basically, don't attack the nuclear plant or launch attacks from the plant. And secondly, don't militarize the nuclear power plant.
In June 2023, the chance arose to leave via the city of Novoazovsk. We decided to break out.
He managed to escape and is now in safety. Then, in June 2023, Zaporizhzhia was back in the headlines.
It's the world's largest man-made disaster in decades. Towns and villages in the Kherson region are flooded. Residents are being evacuated.
After the destruction of the Kakhovka Dam in Ukraine, 3,000 people have had to leave their homes.
I was worried after the dam at the Kakhovka hydropower plant was blown up. We were all very worried about the Zaporizhzhia plant because we knew it hadn't been shut down and that now there might not be enough water to cool the fuel.
Russia, whose forces controlled the dam and the areas around it, blamed Ukraine for the destruction. But both the Reuters news agency and the New York Times published evidence pointing to Russian responsibility. The dam regulated the local water supply, including for the nuclear power plant. In the hours after the blast, experts feared that the power plant could run out of cooling water.
Essential for the safety of this plant is that the water that you see behind me stays at that level.
Thankfully, it turned out that the pumps could continue working even with the water at a much lower level. The immediate threat was averted. But the catastrophic situation at the nuclear power plant remains. And Russia's war continues.
The threats that I worry more about are actually some that have come from Russian intellectuals. There are people like Dr. Sergei Karaganov and Dmitry Trenin. And Karaganov wrote an article that basically said it's time to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. He was suggesting that Russia not nuke Ukraine, but rather its neighbors, and namely Poland and Romania. That also is intimidation. The fact that it comes from Russian elites who advise Putin actually worries it more than hearing it from Putin occasionally. It worries me more.
Neither the Ukrainian summer offensive in 2023 nor the Russian winter offensive did much to change the situation. Conditions at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant remained unstable. April 2024 saw a further escalation. Severe drone attacks were reported by the IAEA observers. Once again, the public was very concerned about nuclear safety.
The nuclear blackmail is specifically what it is. It is a blackmail. And it loses its effectiveness if the other side refuses to be blackmailed.
These events happening at the Zaporizhzhia power plant have not just disappeared in the fog of war. Instead, the plant has become a symbol of Russia's unlawful war of aggression on my country.
You have to have nuclear responsibility as a state. And what's happened since the invasion of Ukraine, February 24th of 2022, is Russia, in my opinion, has become an irresponsible nuclear state. And that's the threat today, and that threat is huge.
And then, on August 6th, 2024, Ukraine made a surprise advance into Russia's Kursk region, home to the Kursk nuclear power plant. For the first time, Ukrainian troops were now on Russian soil. A few days later in the Zaporizhzhia plant, a fire broke out in one of the cooling systems. Well over 2 years after the plant's capture, the situation is still very volatile. When I started making this film in 2022, I was naive enough to believe that the last scene would show the liberation of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. I'm still hoping for that day.